The rain fell in sheets that November evening, turning the sidewalks of downtown Atlanta into rivers of reflected neon and broken dreams. Each droplet seemed to carry the weight of the city's indifference as it struck the cracked concrete beneath the feet of those who called these streets home. Among them walked a figure that most eyes refused to see, a man hunched beneath a threadbare hoodie, his weathered sneakers splashing through puddles that mirrored the towering glass monuments to wealth surrounding him. The city's pulse thrummed around him, the hum of expensive cars, the click of designer heels against marble, the soft whoosh of revolving doors that separated the warm, bright interiors from the cold, harsh reality of the streets. But for Marcus, these sounds had become the soundtrack to an invisible existence. People streamed past him like water around stone, their gazes sliding away as if he were nothing more than urban furniture. Those brave enough to acknowledge his presence looked through him rather than at him, as if his humanity were somehow negotiable. In his pocket, Marcus felt the familiar weight of 7 crumpled dollar bills, his entire fortune in this moment. No credit cards, no identification, no keys to a home that didn't exist. For 8 months now, this had been his reality. 8 months of learning what it meant to be discarded by society, to be reduced to nothing more than a problem to be solved or an inconvenience to be avoided. But Marcus carried a secret that would have shattered the assumptions of every person who stepped around him on that rain-soaked sidewalk. He wasn't what he appeared to be, not even close. The man beneath the hood held degrees from Stanford and MIT. His mind, sharp as the November wind cutting through downtown Atlanta, had once navigated boardrooms and commanded respect in venture capital meetings. He had built companies from nothing, turned ideas into empires, and amassed a fortune that most could only dream of. Yet here he stood, invisible and ignored, having voluntarily stripped away every marker of his success to understand a world that existed parallel to his own. This wasn't desperation that drove him to the streets. It was purpose. Marcus had embarked on what he called a radical empathy project, determined to design a nonprofit that would actually serve people rather than statistics. He understood that true solutions could only come from true understanding, and true understanding required him to walk in shoes he had never worn before. The months had been a brutal education. He had learned the geography of hunger, mapping out which restaurants threw away food at what times, which shelter beds were safest, which alleys offered the best protection from both weather and predators. He discovered the complex social hierarchies that existed among the homeless community, the unwritten rules, the codes of survival, the fierce loyalty that bound people together when the rest of the world had abandoned them. He had sat across from war veterans whose minds bore scars from distant battlefields, men and women who had served their country only to find themselves forgotten by it. He had met teenage runaways who had fled homes where love came wrapped in violence, trading one form of danger for another. He had shared meals with brilliant minds trapped in circumstances beyond their control, a former teacher who lost everything to medical debt, a skilled carpenter whose injury ended both his career and his housing stability. But perhaps most painful of all, Marcus had learned how quickly dignity could be stripped away. He watched people cross streets to avoid him. He saw hands instinctively clutch purses tighter when he passed. Store owners followed him with suspicious eyes or simply asked him to leave before he had even spoken. The world had taught him a harsh lesson. In the eyes of society, he had become less than human. Each day brought fresh reminders of his invisible status. A businessman who wouldn't make eye contact while dropping change into his cup. A group of college students who laughed and pointed as they passed, treating his suffering as entertainment. A police officer who moved him along from a public bench where he had committed no crime other than existing while poor. These experiences carved themselves into Marcus's memory, shaping his understanding of the systemic machinery that kept people trapped in cycles of poverty and marginalization. He began to see how homelessness wasn't just about lacking shelter. It was about lacking dignity, hope, and basic human recognition. On this particular November night, the rain seemed determined to wash the city clean, though Marcus knew some stains ran too deep to be cleansed by water alone. He had taken shelter under the awning of a gleaming corporate office building, its lobby glowing like a beacon of warmth and prosperity just beyond the glass doors. The building housed several major companies, and Marcus had often watched their employees come and go, living lives that felt a universe away from his current existence. The clock on the building's digital display read 11:17 p.m. when the sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. Its engine purred with the quiet confidence of German engineering, and its paint job reflected the city lights like liquid obsidian. The door opened, and out stepped a woman who seemed to embody everything this world valued: power, success, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about where your next meal would come from. Her heels announced her presence with sharp, staccato clicks against the wet pavement. Each step seemed to proclaim her importance, her right to occupy space in a way that Marcus had learned he no longer possessed. Her coat was expensive, the kind of expensive that whispered rather than shouted, and her hair was styled with the precision that only came from having both the money and time to maintain such perfection. When her eyes landed on Marcus, something shifted in her expression. It wasn't surprise. People like him were everywhere in the city. It was something closer to disgust, as if his very presence somehow contaminated the pristine world she inhabited. "Ugh," she said, loud enough to ensure he heard every syllable. "They're everywhere now." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Marcus said nothing, simply looked at her with eyes that had seen too much in too few months. He had learned that engaging often made things worse, that defending himself only confirmed their suspicions that he was dangerous or unstable. She seemed to interpret his silence as defiance rather than resignation. Her eyes narrowed as she studied him, perhaps calculating the threat he posed to her evening routine. "You people need to get off private property," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Marcus knew he was standing on a public sidewalk. The law was clear about his right to be there, but he had learned that legal rights meant little when you looked like he did. Instead of arguing, he simply stepped aside, moving closer to the building's edge to give her a wider berth. But his compliance only seemed to embolden her. She pulled out her phone, the latest model, Marcus noted, probably costing more than most people on these streets saw in months. The camera flash briefly illuminated the space between them as she captured his image. "If you are enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means a lot to us. We are just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you." And back to the video. "I'm sending this to building security," she announced, her fingers already dancing across the screen. "And to social media. Maybe if y'all stopped being lazy and got a job, the rest of us wouldn't have to deal with this." The casual cruelty of her words hit Marcus like physical blows. He had heard variations of this sentiment countless times over the past months, but it never stopped cutting deep. The assumption that poverty was a choice, that homelessness was a character flaw rather than a circumstance, that people living on the streets were somehow less deserving of basic human respect. He remained silent as she finished her social media post, adding what he was sure were carefully chosen words designed to garner maximum sympathy for her plight of having to encounter the city's less fortunate residents. She looked at him one final time, shook her head in apparent disgust, and clicked her way into the building's warm embrace. Within hours, her post had taken on a life of its own. The image of Marcus, looking tired and defeated under the building's harsh lighting, became the focal point of a viral social media storm. Her caption read, "Another bum loitering near my office. I work hard, so I don't have to live like this. Why should hard-working people have to deal with this every day?" The responses poured in like a digital avalanche. Thousands of likes from people who felt their own frustrations validated by her bold stance. Comments ranged from supportive to savage, with many users sharing their own stories of uncomfortable encounters with homeless individuals. The post was shared across platforms, picked up by local news outlets, and soon became the center of heated debates about urban policy and personal responsibility. But buried among the supportive comments were other voices. Social workers who tried to explain the complex factors that led to homelessness. Former military personnel who spoke about the challenges veterans faced, mental health advocates who pointed out the inadequacy of social services. Their measured responses were often drowned out by the louder voices demanding simple solutions to complex problems. None of them knew the truth about the man in the photograph. None of them could have imagined that within 12 hours, everything would change. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the previous night's rain having washed the city clean and left the air smelling of possibility. At 8:30 a.m. sharp, Marcus approached the same building where he had been photographed and humiliated. But this time, everything was different. Gone was the threadbare hoodie, replaced by a tailored navy suit that spoke of boardrooms and corner offices. His hair was perfectly cut, his beard neatly trimmed, and his shoes, Italian leather that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent, clicked against the pavement with the same authority that had marked the woman's arrival the night before. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were two senior executives from Mosaic Impact Group, their faces serious and professional. Behind them walked a carefully assembled PR team, their tablets and phones at the ready to document whatever was about to unfold. Because Marcus held another secret that none of the social media commentators could have guessed. He wasn't just a millionaire playing at poverty. He was the newly appointed CEO of Mosaic Impact Group, a strategic partner firm to Apex Solutions, the building's largest and most influential tenant. The months he had spent on the streets were over. His research was complete, and now it was time to put his findings to work. The lobby buzzed with its usual morning energy as Marcus and his team entered. Executives checked their phones while grabbing coffee. Administrative assistants juggled schedules and phone calls. Security guards nodded professionally at the well-dressed group making their way to the elevators. And there, near the reception desk, stood Vanessa Carter. She was reviewing something on her tablet when she looked up and saw him approaching. For a moment, her brain struggled to process what her eyes were showing her. The face was familiar, but the context was all wrong. This couldn't be the same man she had photographed and publicly shamed less than 12 hours earlier. But it was. Recognition hit her like a physical blow, draining the color from her face and leaving her speechless. Her tablet slipped from her fingers, clattering against the marble floor, but going unnoticed. Her mouth opened and closed silently as she tried to reconcile the homeless man from her viral post with the impeccably dressed executive now standing before her. Marcus caught her eye and offered a polite, professional nod, the kind of acknowledgement one gave to a business colleague. "Good morning," he said simply, his voice carrying no trace of anger or accusation. Vanessa couldn't respond, could barely breathe. The implications of her mistake began crashing over her in waves. The viral post, the thousands of people who had seen it, the comments she had encouraged, the professional reputation she had built, all of it suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. As Marcus and his team disappeared into the elevator, heading to what she now realized must be a very important meeting, Vanessa remained frozen in place. Other employees moved around her, continuing their morning routines, unaware that her world had just shifted on its axis. The all-staff meeting was called for 10 a.m. Attendance was mandatory, though no one seemed to know exactly what it was about. Rumors circulated through the building's corridors, a merger, a major announcement, perhaps a new partnership. The conference room filled quickly, with employees from multiple companies cramming into seats and lining the walls. When Marcus took the stage, many in the audience were seeing him for the first time. To them, he was simply another executive about to deliver another corporate presentation. They couldn't have known that some of them had liked, shared, or commented on a post featuring this very man just hours earlier. Vanessa sat in the back row, still trying to process the morning's revelation. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications from her viral post, each ping now feeling like an accusation rather than validation. Marcus began to speak, his voice calm and measured. He didn't mention Vanessa by name. He didn't single anyone out for shame or ridicule. Instead, he told a story with the skill of someone who understood the power of narrative to change minds and hearts. He shared photos from his time on the streets, images that starkly contrasted with his current appearance. He showed data about homelessness, unemployment, and the barriers that prevented people from climbing out of poverty. He told stories of the people he had met, giving names and faces to statistics that were too often reduced to policy talking points. There was Sarah, a former nurse who lost her job and apartment after a car accident left her unable to work for months. Medical bills consumed her savings, and by the time she recovered, she found herself competing for minimum wage jobs with a gap in her employment history that no one wanted to explain. There was David, a veteran who served 3 tours in Afghanistan only to come home to a country that seemed to have forgotten what service meant. PTSD made it difficult to hold steady employment, and the VA benefits he had earned weren't enough to keep up with rising housing costs. There was Maria, a teenager who aged out of the foster care system at 18 with no family support, no savings, and no safety net. Despite her intelligence and determination, she found herself working multiple part-time jobs that still couldn't cover rent in a city where affordable housing had become an oxymoron. As Marcus spoke, the room grew increasingly quiet. The comfortable distance between us and them began to dissolve as employees realized these weren't abstract problems happening to other people somewhere else. These were their neighbors, their fellow human beings, people who had fallen through cracks in a system that many in the room had never questioned. Marcus pulled up social media posts on a large screen, not just Vanessa's, but dozens of others like it. Images of homeless individuals accompanied by commentary ranging from frustrated to cruel. He didn't identify the posters or shame them individually. Instead, he used them to illustrate a larger point about how society had learned to dehumanize poverty. "We tell ourselves stories," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Stories that make us comfortable with inequality. Stories that suggest people who are poor must deserve it, that homelessness is the result of personal failures rather than systemic ones. But what if those stories are wrong? What if the only difference between us and them is circumstance?" If you are enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means a lot to us. We are just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you. And back to the video. He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final question. "How many CEOs, artists, veterans, students have you walked past because you judged them by their worst day rather than their potential?" The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, everyone in the room was forced to confront their own assumptions, their own prejudices, their own role in perpetuating a system that reduced human beings to inconveniences to be avoided. Vanessa sat frozen as Marcus concluded his presentation. She knew that everyone who had seen her post, possibly including people in this very room, would eventually connect the dots. Her viral moment of frustrated superiority had become a case study in unconscious bias, a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance. 2 weeks later, Vanessa submitted a resignation. She claimed it was for personal reasons, but the damage to her professional reputation had been swift and severe. The internet, which had initially celebrated her bold stance against urban blight, had turned against her once Marcus's identity became known. Her LinkedIn profile was flooded with comments questioning her judgment and empathy. Job interviews became minefields where potential employers asked carefully worded questions about her viral moment. But Marcus had never sought revenge against Vanessa or anyone else who had treated him poorly during his months on the streets. His goal wasn't punishment, but transformation. The Face Forward initiative he launched became his vehicle for creating the change he envisioned. The program was ambitious in scope and revolutionary in approach. Rather than simply offering charity or temporary assistance, Face Forward aimed to dismantle the systemic barriers that kept people trapped in cycles of poverty. Marcus partnered with major corporations to implement empathy training programs that helped employees understand complex factors behind homelessness. He worked with HR departments to develop hiring practices that didn't automatically exclude people with gaps in employment history or unconventional living situations. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within 6 months, Face Forward had placed over 200 people in stable employment across 12 major companies. But more importantly, it had begun to shift the conversation around poverty from one of blame to one of solutions. Marcus returned frequently to the shelters and soup kitchens, where he had once sought aid, but now he came with checkbooks and blueprints. He worked with city planners to develop what he called reentry zones, not for ex-convicts, but for people transitioning from homelessness to housing stability. These areas featured affordable housing, job training centers, and support services, all within walking distance of each other. The Riverside Reentry Community became the flagship project, a mixed-income development that housed formerly homeless individuals alongside young professionals and families. Rather than concentrating poverty in one area, the development promoted integration and mutual support. Residents who had once been homeless became mentors for newcomers, while other residents gained first-hand understanding of the challenges their neighbors had overcome. One of Marcus's most powerful moments came when he hired Jeremy, a 22-year-old he had met at a downtown shelter. Jeremy had been living in his car for 8 months, unable to get work because he had no address to list on job applications. The circular logic was maddening. No job meant no apartment, but no apartment meant no job. Through Face Forward, Jeremy was placed in a software engineering position at a tech startup. Within a year, he had become one of their top performers, designing applications that would eventually be used by other nonprofits to track and assist homeless populations. Jeremy's transformation from invisible to invaluable became a testament to the potential that society too often overlooked. Elena's story was equally powerful. A single mother of 2, she had been turned away from the Westside Women's Shelter 3 times due to capacity issues before finally being admitted for a 2-week stay. The shelter's rules were strict: no children over 12, no staying past 7 a.m., no exceptions for sick children who couldn't attend school. 2 years after participating in Face Forward's job placement program, Elena returned to that same shelter as its new director. Her lived experience informed every policy change she implemented, from extending hours to accommodate working parents to creating on-site childcare for mothers attending job interviews. But success brought its own challenges. As Face Forward gained national attention, Marcus began receiving anonymous threats. One message, sent to his corporate email, read, "Stay in your lane. Nobody wants to work with a homeless-loving fraud. Some people are meant to fail." Others were more direct in their opposition. A group calling itself Taxpayers First protested outside Face Forward events, carrying signs that read, "Stop rewarding failure and work, don't beg." They distributed flyers questioning Marcus's credentials and motivations, suggesting his time on the streets was nothing more than a publicity stunt designed to profit from liberal guilt. Marcus refused to be deterred. If anything, the opposition convinced him that his work was necessary. During a televised panel debate about urban policy, a conservative pundit directly challenged his approach. "Aren't you just rewarding bad decisions by giving these people jobs they haven't earned?" the pundit asked, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had never questioned his own advantages. Marcus leaned forward, his response measured but passionate. "You say that like people choose to be invisible, like sleeping in the cold, dodging violence, and eating from dumpsters is a lifestyle people aspire to. That's the problem with how we discuss poverty in this country. We blame the symptom instead of addressing the system that creates it." The exchange went viral in its own right, with clips racking up millions of views across social media platforms. But unlike Vanessa's post months earlier, this viral moment sparked conversations about solutions rather than scapegoating. As public awareness grew, more companies joined the Face Forward network. Major retailers began hiring program participants for management positions. Tech companies created apprenticeship programs specifically for people transitioning from homelessness. Even traditionally conservative industries like banking and insurance began to recognize the talent they had been overlooking. Vanessa's story, meanwhile, became a cautionary tale that circulated in business schools and corporate training programs. Her viral post was eventually leaked during an audit of her former employer's social media policies, sparking new discussions about the personal and professional risks of public shaming. She attempted a comeback through a series of public apologies and interviews about lessons learned. But the internet's memory proved unforgiving. and her attempts at redemption often felt performative rather than genuine. She eventually moved to another city and took a lower-profile position at a smaller firm, her dreams of social media influence having become a liability rather than an asset. Marcus never commented publicly on Vanessa's fate. When asked about her during interviews, he consistently redirected the conversation back to the people Face Forward was serving. His focus remained on stories of transformation and hope rather than accounts of judgment and downfall. By the end of its first year, Face Forward had raised over $18 million and placed more than 800 people in sustainable employment. But Marcus measured success in more personal terms. In the video calls from Jeremy showing off his new apartment, in Elena's updates about policy changes at the shelter, in the dozens of thank you letters from families who had found stability through the program. The initiative expanded beyond job placement to address the root causes of homelessness. Face Forward lobbied for zoning changes that would allow more affordable housing development. They partnered with medical schools to provide healthcare services to homeless populations. They worked with local transit authorities to ensure that people without cars could still access employment opportunities. Perhaps most importantly, they changed the narrative around homelessness from one of individual failure to one of systemic challenge requiring collective solutions. Marcus's story became a modern parable, illustrating how quickly circumstances could change and how dangerously easy it was to dismiss people based on appearances. In quiet moments, Marcus often thought about that rainy November night when Vanessa had photographed him under the office building's awning. He wondered what might have happened if she had chosen compassion over contempt, if she had seen him as a human being rather than a problem to be solved through social media shaming. But he also recognized that her reaction had been shaped by the same systemic forces that created homelessness in the first place. A culture that valued productivity over humanity, that measured worth through wealth, and that taught people to fear rather than to understand poverty. The real victory wasn't in Vanessa's downfall, but in the hundreds of people who had found dignity and opportunity through Face Forward. It was in the policy changes that made housing more accessible, the corporate practices that valued potential over pedigree, and the slowly shifting cultural conversations that recognized homelessness as a solvable problem rather than an inevitable reality. As Marcus stood in his office 2 years later, looking out at the city where he had once been invisible, he thought about the lessons his time on the streets had taught him. The most important one wasn't about poverty or policy or corporate responsibility. It was about the fundamental human need to be seen, to be valued, to be treated with dignity regardless of circumstances. He had learned that change didn't start with power or money or influence, though all of those things could amplify its impact. Real change started with the simple recognition that every person, regardless of their appearance, their address, or their apparent circumstances, carried within them the potential for transformation. The question he had posed to that conference room still echoed in his mind. How many CEOs, artists, veterans, students have you walked past because you judged them by their worst day? It was a question that demanded more than academic consideration. It required a fundamental shift in how society chose to see and value human life. And as Face Forward continued to grow, touching more lives and changing more hearts, Marcus knew that the answer was slowly but surely changing. Because in the end, dignity wasn't something that could be earned or lost. It was something that belonged to every person simply by virtue of being human. And once people began to see that truth, everything else became possible.